Few shows in television history were canceled, nearly forgotten, and then came roaring back to reshape an entire culture. But Star Trek did exactly that. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 15 shocking behind-the-scenes facts that will completely change the way you look at the original series. From a studio boss who couldn't even describe what she was funding, to a religious gesture that accidentally became science fiction's most iconic hand signal, these stories go way deeper than the show itself. And stay with me until the very end, because the bonus fact is something almost nobody talks about, and when you hear it, you'll never watch the finale the same way again. So speed up with me, because the list starts now. Number 1. Saved by a studio head. Here's the thing about Star Trek. It almost never made it to a single living room television set. Before audiences ever saw the Enterprise, before Spock raised an eyebrow, before Kirk gave one single dramatic pause, NBC nearly killed the whole thing stone dead. In 1965, the network rejected the show's very first pilot episode, titled The Cage. They found it confusing, too cerebral, too strange. The studio producing it, Desilu Productions, was nervous. That should have been the end, except it wasn't, because of one woman. Lucille Ball owned and operated Desilu, making her one of the most powerful executives in Hollywood at a time when almost no women held that kind of authority. When her board of directors urged her to cut losses, and when her accountants warned that bankrolling a second expensive space production could sink the entire company, she approved it anyway. The famous story, and it has been told and retold at conventions and in books, is that Lucy didn't even fully understand what she was greenlit. She reportedly believed Star Trek was about entertainers traveling by ship to perform for U.S. troops overseas. When someone explained it was actually about a starship, aliens, and pointed ears, her response was essentially, "Fine, we're doing it." That second pilot became the episode where no man has gone before. NBC approved it, and the rest is history. Without Lucille Ball, there is no Enterprise. No Spock, no films, no spin-offs, no conventions, no franchise. The entire Star Trek universe exists because one woman overruled her board and bet on a show nobody else believed in. Number 2. The first female officer erased from history. Long before the world ever met Mr. Spock, the Enterprise already had a female first officer in command. And she was extraordinary, logical, unflappable, sharp, and completely in charge. Then NBC erased her. In the original 1965 pilot, The Cage, actress Majel Barrett played a character known only as Number 1. She was everything you'd want in a commanding officer: analytical, emotionally controlled, and deeply authoritative. NBC's response was swift and brutal. Network executives argued that American audiences simply wouldn't accept a woman issuing orders to men, especially one who wasn't warm or deferential or conventionally agreeable. It didn't help that Barrett was in a relationship with creator Gene Roddenberry, and the network didn't like the optics of an unknown actress holding such a key role. When NBC ordered a second pilot, Number 1 was quietly written out, but Roddenberry didn't throw away what the character represented. Instead, he transferred her defining qualities, in the cool logic, the emotional restraint, the razor-sharp composure, directly into Spock. Here's where it gets interesting. In the original pilot, Spock had actually been more reactive and emotional. After the rewrite, he became the deeply logical figure audiences came to love. Because those traits had originally been written for a woman, the network refused to put on screen. Majel Barrett didn't disappear. She came back as Nurse Christine Chapel. She later married Roddenberry, and for decades, she voiced the onboard computer across multiple Star Trek series until her death in 2008. In a very real sense, she never left the Enterprise. If you're enjoying this content, take 2 seconds and leave a like. Subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. This support really motivates my work and helps a lot in bringing more content. Number 3. Spock's appearance was almost completely different. Think about the version of Spock you know. Pale, sharp-browed, those unmistakable pointed ears. Now imagine him with bright red skin, because that's what Gene Roddenberry originally wanted. The idea was to lean into the alien quality, make Spock visually shocking and unmistakably otherworldly. It fell apart almost immediately. In 1966, a significant portion of American households still watched television on black and white sets. When test footage was developed, the red makeup processed as a flat, muddy gray on those screens. It didn't read as alien. It just looked like something was wrong with the camera. NBC had a different problem entirely. Executives looked at Spock's pointed ears and sharp, angular eyebrows and decided he looked satanic. They were genuinely worried about complaints from religious viewers. Early publicity photos were actually edited, ears rounded, eyebrows softened, to make him appear more human. Before promotional materials went out, makeup artist Fred Phillips solved the color issue by switching to a yellow-green tint. That looked fine on the set under the lights. But here's where it gets absurd. When the film was sent to the lab for development, technicians kept assuming the greenish skin tone was a processing error and corrected it back to normal pink human flesh over and over again. The crew had to keep sending notes, explaining that yes, the green skin was intentional. Even the people developing the film couldn't believe it. Once the show aired, nobody saw a devil. Audiences saw the breakout star of the entire series. Number 4. A religious gesture became an icon of science fiction. The Vulcan salute is one of the most recognized hand gestures on the planet. It's been flashed at funerals, at weddings, at sporting events, in classrooms, and on the surface of Mars in NASA photos. It didn't come from a script. It came from a little boy who couldn't stop himself from peeking. Leonard Nimoy grew up in Boston in a Jewish family and attended an Orthodox synagogue with his parents. During one particular religious ceremony, a special blessing called the priestly benediction, the congregation was told to close their eyes or bow their heads. The tradition held that a holy divine presence arrived during the blessing, and no one was supposed to watch. Young Leonard looked anyway. What he saw left a permanent impression. The priests extended their hands outward with their fingers split into a distinctive V shape. That formation spelled out the Hebrew letter Shin, which is one of the abbreviations used for a name of God. The gesture was ancient, solemn, and charged with meaning. It stayed in the mind of that curious kid for decades. Years later, while filming the second season episode Amok Time, the script called for a traditional Vulcan greeting. Nimoy suggested the hand shape from his childhood. The director agreed, the cameras rolled, and an ancient sacred symbol quietly entered science fiction history. Nimoy later said that one of his greatest joys was knowing that millions of fans across the world were unknowingly blessing each other every single time they said, "Live long and prosper." Number 5. The kiss that terrified a TV station. In 1968, Star Trek aired an episode called Plato's Stepchildren that included a kiss between William Shatner and Lucille Nichols. Watch it today and the moment feels perfectly natural. In 1968, it sent NBC into a quiet panic. The network was nervous about a potential backlash, particularly from affiliate stations in the American South that might simply refuse to broadcast the episode. Executives demanded that the production team film an alternate version of the scene, one where Shatner and Nichols leaned in but never actually made contact. The studio hoped they could use the safer take and avoid any controversy. The two actors had their own plans. According to Nichols, she and Shatner ruined every single alternate take with deliberate sabotage. They crossed their eyes. They fumbled their timing. They made faces. On the very last attempt, Shatner allegedly stared directly and visibly into the camera lens so that his expression would be impossible to cut around in editing. Production ran out of both time and budget. The only clean, usable take was the original, the real kiss. NBC held its breath. The flood of angry letters never came. Instead, the network received an overwhelming wave of positive mail. Many viewers wrote in saying they couldn't understand what the fuss was about or why anyone would object. The audience had already moved past the thing the executives had spent weeks trying to protect them from. The people in the boardroom were behind their own viewers, and they didn't even know it. Number 6. The theme song that enriched the creator of the series. The opening theme of Star Trek is one of the most iconic pieces of music in television history. Composer Alexander Courage wrote it with sweep and intention. It sounds like the stars themselves opening up. What most fans have never known is that Gene Roddenberry spent years collecting half the money from that music without writing a single note. Here's how the loophole worked. Courage's contract included a standard clause common in the music industry at the time. If anyone added lyrics to the theme, they would cower a beer 15 why. That person would become legally entitled to half the royalties every time the song played. Royalties are the payments a songwriter receives each time their work is used commercially. So Roddenberry wrote lyrics. They weren't broadcast quality lyrics. They weren't even meant to be sung on air. They included vague lines about love and starlight, the kind of words you'd find on a motivational poster from 1962. Roddenberry filed them, collected his co-writer credit, and said nothing. Every time Star Trek aired, in first run, in reruns, in syndication around the world, in promotional clips, half of what should have been Courage's check went to Roddenberry instead. Courage found out and was absolutely furious. He understood the move was legal, but he never forgave Roddenberry for it. The two men's professional relationship collapsed, and Courage didn't return to score subsequent seasons. Meanwhile, the show kept airing. The films arrived. Those unsung, never broadcast lyrics ended up earning enormous sums, not just for Roddenberry during his lifetime, but for his estate long after he was gone. Number 7. The Enterprise engineer was a true war hero. Before James Doohan ever touched a console on the set of Star Trek, he had already lived through one of the most violent days of the 20th century. Long before Montgomery Scott was directing power to the warp engines, Doohan was a combat soldier. He served as a lieutenant in the Canadian Army and landed on Juno Beach in Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Under heavy German fire, he led his men through a minefield and personally helped neutralize 2 enemy snipers. For most soldiers, that would have been the defining moment of their entire lives. Doohan's worst moment came later that same night. Moving between command posts in the darkness, he was shot 6 times by a nervous Canadian sentry who mistook him for an enemy soldier. 4 bullets struck his leg. 1 shattered his right middle finger. The 6th was fired directly at his chest and should have killed him outright. It would have, except a silver cigarette case in his breast pocket, a gift from his brother, stopped the bullet cold. He lost the finger. He kept his life. When Doohan joined Star Trek as Scotty, he worked constantly to hide the missing digit. He controlled the angle of his hand in scenes. The production occasionally brought in a hand double for close-up shots. Most viewers never noticed anything. A handful of sharp-eyed fans eventually spotted it, most famously in The Trouble with Tribbles, where Scotty's hands briefly appear buried under a pile of the fuzzy creatures. It turns out the Enterprise's chief engineer had been the toughest man in the room the entire time. Before we continue, subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment telling me which movie or series you'd like me to cover with weird behind-the-scenes facts. I read them all. Number 8. A city claimed the birth of a captain who has not yet been born. Now check this out. In 1985, a tiny town in Iowa made an official government decision about a man who won't exist for a few hundred years. The town of Riverside, Iowa, voted unanimously to declare itself the future birthplace of Captain James T. Kirk. The whole thing started with a single throwaway line in a 1968 nonfiction book called The Making of Star Trek, which mentioned that Kirk had been born in a small town somewhere in Iowa. No coordinates, no county, no name, just Iowa. Riverside simply raised its hand and said, "That's us." Gene Roddenberry gave the town his personal blessing, which was enough to make it feel official. From there, Riverside committed to the bit completely. They built a museum called the Voyage Home. They installed a historical marker at the precise spot where Kirk will one day be born. A local bar added a plaque noting the exact location where Kirk will be conceived, which is either charming or deeply strange, depending on how you look at it. Every June, the town hosts a festival called Trekfest, complete with parades, panels, costume contests, and appearances from actual Star Trek actors including William Shatner and George Takei. It's a real birthday celebration for a fictional man who hasn't been born yet, and it draws fans from around the world. Then, in 2009, the J.J. Abrams reboot film showed Kirk's Iowa childhood on the big screen for the first time, effectively confirming what Riverside had quietly been claiming for nearly a quarter century. Reality, fiction, and municipal government had finally all agreed on something. Number 9. The Tribbles who refused to disappear. The Trouble with Tribbles was supposed to be the lightest, most carefree episode of Star Trek's second season. Cute, fuzzy little creatures, multiplying out of control and slowly taking over the ship. Harmless, fun. Behind the scenes, it created a problem that haunted the production for for weeks to pull off the visual of thousands of tribbles. The prop team only built about 500 of them. They were simple, puffs of fake fur stuffed with foam rubber, though some had wind-up toy mechanisms inside so they could wobble convincingly across the floor. They were cheap, they were effective, and they were nearly impossible to get rid of. Once filming wrapped, the tribbles stayed. They kept reappearing for weeks in places nobody could explain, inside lighting rigs, in desk drawers, tucked into equipment cases, hidden inside air vents. Nobody remembered putting them there. DeForest Kelley later described the experience as tiny surprises from the props department long after the cameras had stopped rolling. The cast made it worse. People started hiding tribbles in each other's costumes and lunch bags. Kelley apparently pulled a tribble out of a prop body cavity during a completely unrelated episode, purely to make the other actors break. The famous avalanche scene, where a storage compartment bursts open and buries Shatner in a cascade of fur, took 8 takes. The crew dropping tribbles from above couldn't see Shatner underneath them, so they just kept throwing more to be safe. When production finally closed, many tribbles vanished into personal collections. Others were donated to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, where some are still on display today. Number 10. The communicator that inspired the cell phone. On Star Trek, the handheld communicator was pure imagination. A small device, a flip of the lid, instant voice communication across vast distances. In 1966, it looked like something that could never actually exist. A few years later, an engineer at Motorola decided it should. Martin Cooper invented the world's first handheld mobile phone in 1973. He has publicly and repeatedly credited Star Trek as an inspiration. He watched Captain Kirk flip open that little device and talk into it, and he believed the real world deserved something exactly like it. But here's the thing. When documentary crews started digging deeper, Cooper shared a fuller version of the story. His actual childhood inspiration had been the two-way wrist radio used by Dick Tracy in the comic strips. That was the first thing that sparked his imagination as a boy. The Star Trek connection, while genuine, was a more polished version of a messier truth. And by the time cameras showed up, it had become the version everyone wanted to hear. Motorola eventually leaned into the connection completely. When the company launched a phone called the StarTAC in 1996, the name was a direct tribute to the Starship Enterprise. The flip-open design was no accident either. It was a deliberate visual nod to Kirk's communicator. A piece of science fiction from the 1960s had finally landed in millions of people's pockets 30 years later. Number 11. The corset rumor that never goes away. There is a rumor about William Shatner that has circulated for roughly 60 years, and at this point, most fans repeat it as established fact. The claim is that Shatner wore a girdle under his Starfleet uniform to keep Captain Kirk looking trim on camera. It comes up at fan conventions. It gets posted in online forums. It shows up in listicles about classic television costuming. None of it is true. Shatner has denied it in interviews, in written memoirs, and in person, with the kind of patient exhaustion you'd expect from someone who has been asked about his underwear for more than half his life. He's been remarkably good-humored about it, but the answer has always been the same. No girdle, just an actor working an intense schedule. The rumor almost certainly started because Kirk's physique shifted slightly across the show's 3 seasons. That tends to happen when a person is working 12 to 15-hour days, 6 days a week for years running. The body changes. A joke at a convention became an online claim. An online claim became a piece of trivia that people now present as fact without a second thought. What makes it stick is that 1960s television really did put enormous pressure on its leading men to maintain a certain look on camera. That part is historically accurate. The specific belief that Shatner must have been physically compressed by undergarments, however, is simply not supported by anything. Sometimes a rumor survives not because it's true, but because it's too entertaining to check. Number 12. The fans who saved the show with letters. Long before social media campaigns, before hashtags and petitions and coordinated online pressure, Star Trek fans pulled off one of the most organized and effective audience revolts in television history, using typewriters, postage stamps, and an extraordinary amount of patience. In late 1967, news leaked that NBC was planning to cancel the show after its second season. The fans refused to accept it. Led by a dedicated Star Trek enthusiast named Bijo Trimble and her husband, fans launched what became known as the Rule of 10. Each fan would write a personal letter to NBC, then convince 10 friends to do the same. Each of those 10 would recruit 10 more. The idea spread rapidly through fan clubs and college campuses. NBC officially reported receiving more than 116,000 letters, but the real total, including group mailings, petitions, and organized submissions, was reportedly close to 1 million pieces of correspondence. The volume became so overwhelming that the network changed its mind publicly, announcing the show's renewal for a third season during a live broadcast. They also politely asked fans to please stop sending letters, which in itself became a historic footnote. The second wave came after the show was ultimately canceled in 1969. College students at Caltech, MIT, and Berkeley held torchlight marches with signs reading "It is totally illogical to cancel Star Trek." In the 1970s, fans successfully pressured NASA to name the very first space shuttle Enterprise. They kept pushing until the reruns spread globally. Conventions exploded in size, and the studios finally agreed to a motion picture. The show survived entirely because its audience refused to let it die, and the blueprint they created has been used by fan movements ever since. Number 13. The famous phrase that was never said. "Beam me up, Scotty." It's on t-shirts and bumper stickers and coffee mugs. It's been used in political speeches, comedy sketches, and news headlines. Millions of people who have never sat through a single episode of the original series can quote it effortlessly. There's one significant problem. Captain Kirk never actually says it, not once. Not across all 79 original episodes. Kirk comes close many times. He says, "Scotty, beam us up." He says, "Beam me up." He says, "Scotty, get us out of here." The exact words shift constantly, depending on the urgency and dramatic requirements of the moment. But the precise 5-word combination that everyone remembers, "Beam me up, Scotty," does not appear in the show. It's a fascinating example of what happens when a cultural shorthand takes on a life of its own and detaches from its source. By the 1990s, even the cast had stopped trying to correct people. James Doohan, who played Scotty, titled his 1996 autobiography "Beam Me Up, Scotty," which is the most elegant possible acknowledgement that the phrase had grown larger than the show that inspired it. The line had become shorthand for an entire era of television, a quick signal that lets people identify a shared cultural memory, even if the specific memory they think they have never actually happened. It's now one of the most famous misquotes in pop culture history, spoken fluently by people who have no idea they're quoting something that was never said. Quick reminder to subscribe if you're enjoying these revelations. And tell me in the comments, do you know any strange facts about this show that I haven't mentioned? Let's make a list together. Number 14. Martin Luther King Jr. convinced Nichelle Nichols to stay. After the first season of Star Trek, Nichelle Nichols was ready to leave. Broadway had come calling, and she missed the stage deeply. She'd spent years working in musical theater before landing on the Enterprise, and that was where her heart was. Her resignation letter was essentially written. She planned to go back to what she loved. Then she attended an NAACP fundraising event in Beverly Hills. During the event, an organizer approached her and said someone in the room wanted to meet her. They described this person as her biggest fan. Nichols turned around expecting to encounter a regular viewer. She found herself face to face with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When she mentioned she was leaving the show, King stopped her immediately. He asked her not to quit, not for money, not for fame, but because of what Lieutenant Uhura represented to people across the country. For the very first time in American television history, a black woman was not playing a maid, not a punchline, not a silent background presence. She was competent, respected, authoritative, and treated as an equal by her crewmates. King told her something she hadn't anticipated, that Star Trek was the only program he and his wife Coretta allowed their children to stay up late to watch. It wasn't entertainment to him. It was a portrait of a future that was behaving better than the present. The following Monday, Nichols walked back into Gene Roddenberry's office and withdrew her resignation. According to her own account, Roddenberry became emotional and said, "Finally, someone gets it." She stayed for the entire original run and returned for every subsequent film. Number 15. The Enterprise cast finally reached the stars. Gene Roddenberry spent his entire life imagining a future where human beings traveled freely Among the Stars. After he died in 1991, the stars came for him. The first mission happened quietly in 1992. A small portion of Roddenberry's ashes flew aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia for a brief trip in Earth's orbit before returning home. It was an unofficial, symbolic gesture arranged by his widow, a small send-off for a man who had always been looking upward. The second mission went further. In 1997, Roddenberry was included in the world's first commercial memorial spaceflight, joining the remains of counterculture figure Timothy Leary and others whose families had paid for a place aboard. The capsule orbited Earth for roughly 5 years before re-entering the atmosphere in 2002 and burning up, disappearing like a shooting star over the Pacific. Even his exit from orbit felt scripted. Then things got stranger. In 2008, a space tourist brought a small amount of James Doohan's ashes aboard the International Space Station, where they were stored inside a module in orbit for a period before returning to Earth. Doohan, the man who had wanted to reach the stars since he was a soldier, dodging bullets on a Normandy beach, made it. The biggest voyage came in January 2024. A company called Celestis launched a memorial mission aboard the Vulcan Centaur rocket, a name that could only have been chosen deliberately. The payload included the remains of Gene Roddenberry, Majel Barrett, Nichelle Nichols, James Doohan, and DeForest Kelley, launched beyond Earth's gravity and into a permanent orbit around the sun. Star Trek had always promised a future among the stars. More than 50 years after the first episode aired, the people who built that future finally got there, almost at the end, and the best is yet to come. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And leave your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this video is reaching. Bonus: the fact that almost no one mentions. Here's something almost nobody talks about. Here's the fact that changes everything about the show's legacy when you sit with it long enough. The original Star Trek ran for 3 seasons. It struggled constantly with ratings. It was nearly canceled twice. When it finally ended in 1969, NBC made no fanfare. There were no farewell specials, no tribute programming. The show simply stopped. Most people in the industry considered it a modest failure that had run slightly too long. What happened next was almost entirely driven by B. Joe Trimble, the same fan organizer who had coordinated the letter-writing campaign. After cancellation, she and her network didn't stop. They kept pushing syndication deals, kept showing up at studio meetings, kept insisting the show had an audience worth reaching. They were right. When Star Trek entered syndication in the early 1970s, it began airing daily in dozens of markets simultaneously, and something extraordinary happened. The ratings in syndication completely dwarfed what the show had ever achieved during its original network run. A show that the industry had labeled a failure turned out to have been simply running on the wrong schedule at the wrong time, on a network that didn't know how to program it. The fan campaign didn't just save the show during its original broadcast, it created the conditions under which the show could find its true audience after the cameras had already stopped rolling. Everything that came after, the films, the spin-offs, the conventions, the cultural footprint, traces directly back to a group of fans with typewriters who refused to accept that the story was over, and they were right. It wasn't. E esses foram os 15 fatos estranhos sobre Star Trek. Mais bônus que a maioria das pessoas nunca parou para pensar. Few television shows have had a stranger, more unlikely, more improbable journey from a rejected pilot to a permanent place in human culture. Star Trek wasn't just a TV show. It was a pitch for a different kind of future, and the people who made it and the people who watched it turned that pitch into reality piece by piece, decade by decade. If you made it this far, leave a like, subscribe, and comment which fact surprised you the most. Was it Lucille Ball not knowing what she was funding? The Vulcan salute coming from a synagogue? The cast actually reaching the stars after everything they built together? And don't forget to suggest another movie or show that deserves a list of strange facts. The stranger, the better. See you in the next video.